Hello, hello. I am Ben Pick, and thank you for joining me in Running to Write, where I give questionable writing advice through running metaphors. And thank you, everyone, for joining in the live chat. Thank you, Richard. You are, as always, the first one in. Thank you, Adriana, for coming in here while you're working on dinner. And I guess, no, you're not. We're having leftovers tonight. You're hanging out with Rufus, and you're playing video games. There we go. And thank you, Andy, for joining in as well. Now, tonight is all about going from draft 0 to draft 1. I'm sure you've heard me and other authors. Actually, sorry, I should take these out. I was prepping a little video before this, so I don't need those on. And that way I can hear better, I guess, even though my computer's on mute. Anyways, I've said this before. Other authors have said this before. In fact, I think some famous ones have outright stated as much. Essentially, the first draft we write, the 0 draft, is for us, the author. It's our way of telling the story that we have in our heads in a way which we understand it. It's going to be rough. It's going to lack character development, and it likely has a lot of plot holes in it, or possibly dead space where nothing really happens within the story itself. Doesn't matter. In my mind, I need to tune it up before I even get to draft 1. That's why I create that draft 0, because I try to write with stream of consciousness. I'm trying to get all my ideas out as quickly as possible. And a lot of times, like I mentioned, that doesn't mesh well with great writing or great storytelling. And that's perfectly fine. I need to fix things up to get from draft 0 to draft 1. Perfectly normal part of my writing process, and many authors out there. And I may even realize that the story I intended to tell is different than the one I've written. Put simply, draft 0 is for me, whereas draft 1, and let's be honest here, drafts 1 through 5 or possibly 10 are for my alpha readers, if I let them see anything before draft 5. Now, there are two diverging strategies here to revising these draft 0s. The first is to revise as we write. I write a few chapters, and I edit them together, or even on a chapter-by-chapter basis. I write a chapter, I edit it, good to go. These are light edits. I have tweaked moments which seem like downtime for the characters so that way I can build up their eventual stories later. I use a delicate touch in these moments when I'm doing those iterative look-throughs, and I devote entire drafts later on to focusing on, say, correcting the tension across all scenes or maybe certain character developments. Alternatively, there's the complete revision where I start from page 1, go all the way to the end, and overhaul everything I come across. Which method is the right to use? Depends. I actually do both. Now, I've had a lot of trouble writing my 4th novel, so I've been going back and rereading the first few chapters to make sure I have a solid base for the story and that I'm consistent. Consistency is really important for me. And so I want to make sure that my characters don't have the color of their eyes change or their physical attributes or the way they use their powers. I want those to remain consistent. And yes, it is considered procrastination. No, I don't care, because I have been revising the first 4 chapters. I'm in the middle of chapter 9 now in terms of revisions, but I've been going through with those first 4 chapters a couple of times to try and get them in much better shape. And that way I have a great starting base, and then I just move on from there, and the story will naturally progress. But if I feel like I'm standing on sort of shaky foundation, then everything that comes after it, I feel like I'm going to have to make cascading changes to what needs to be done. And that's why I go through with this draft 0 to sort of work on some of those earlier chapters. Which brings me to the tips themselves. These are my tips to go from a book only we, the author, should read to the one that we can be proud of. But before we get started, I am checking in the chat. Oh boy, there's a lot of people here. Thank you for joining in. Morgan, hey, thanks for saying hi. Nicole's Bookish Nook, thank you for joining in. And I think I saw a few other names. Eva, hey, thank you for being here. Yes, the vomit draft. That's actually a pretty good way of putting it. Boy, fun story. I almost vomited on my walk today because I was picking up some trash and oh boy, whatever I picked up, it smelled awful, and that sort of spread to the bucket that I was carrying. So I had to like hold it out at arm's length to try and not gag on the rest of the walk home. So for 20 minutes, I'm trying to like breathe very carefully. And oh boy, I hope that there were no. I mean, I know I walk by people, but I can only imagine what they thought when they see this guy with a dog and a claw and a bucket and just the worst smell coming from me or from the trash in the bucket. And so when I came back here, I just bleached the hell out of it, hit it with a hose, and I hope that I did enough cycles of that no longer smells. Anyways, that's neither here nor there. Bonnie, hey, thank you for being here. Yeah, that's why I was wandering around trying to grab every single cleaning supply um, that I could find in every cabinet and just apply them to the bucket and just sort of hope for the best. No, I don't smell it. It was whatever I. It must have been like raw sewage or something because it was not great. I think it was like an old beer bottle that had gone putrid and. Well, yeah, that's fine. That the bleach bottle didn't do anything. That's why I had the actual bleach stuff that I was using on it. Did BitTorrent again? I have no idea what I was talking about there. I don't think I was ever on BitTorrent. Oh. Anyways, number one, grammar. First thing I do with draft 0 to draft 1. Obviously, I fix it if I can. When I come across an issue, I will make a change. I do this for a couple of different reasons. First of all, that's what I do. But again, it's also, I recognize that fixing the grammar of draft 0 is almost entirely going to be a waste of time. Some writers don't bother touching the grammar at this point, and that makes perfect sense. Especially since my draft 0 will look nothing like draft 1, and especially not the final published version. There will be whole swaths of the story which will be changed, if not entirely. Going from the first draft 0 of my first book, I feel like it was 400,000, maybe 100, whatever. It was a couple 100,000 words that I halved or quartered until I got down to 102,000. I think it just passes the 100,000 mark. Either way, I was just trimming everything in that first book. So working on the grammar at that point doesn't really make sense if you're just going to remove everything or just completely change it. Now, on the other hand, it might make sense to worry about some tiny grammar details, which might actually end up being in the final version of the story. Because yes, I did remove a lot of things, in which case it would make no sense to work on things which will later on be removed, but I don't know what would be removed in advance. So applying that fine-tooth comb to pick up issues every time will help improve the book in the final version. It means that I'll likely, if I read something and I catch a grammar mistake, I will likely misread it in the future, which means that if I do read it, I want to make the change when I see it. So put another way, if I fix the problem as I encounter it, I know I'm going to fix it. If I see a grammar mistake and decide to wait until the next pass through, because that way I'll know that this is definitely, it's more likely that this is something that will make it into the final version. There's a chance my brain will fill in the gaps in the future and mentally read what's not on the page. And that means that the issue will remain unfixed. I think there were a lot of things that I plan to change in the future that I missed. And so in reading the version that either was recently published, so my day one version, or the version that was about to be published, there were a lot of times where I could have sworn that I made a change, but because I kept reading it, I missed the grammar mistakes that I never actually fixed. Or maybe I control Z'd it and brought something back in, or there was some mistake somewhere. Either way, there have been issues grammatically within my writing that I thought I had changed, which obviously I didn't. And so if I fix them whenever I encounter them, that way that's my easy way to handle that issue. So I do deal with grammar, but compared to everything else, this step can easily be ignored. If you're if you don't necessarily care about it, or if you want to wait until the final version, quote unquote, of your book before it gets published, and that's when you start working on grammar. Number 2 is transitions. Going from draft 0 to draft 1, I work on my transitions. That's one of the first things that I really try and work on. So scenes, topics, plot events. I'm very guilty of this. My characters will be in one place, and then the next chapter they will be somewhere else, or it'll be the next day without context of what changed to help the readers. In going from draft 0 to draft 1, I add a sentence or two where the characters are worried about, say, a test in school that'll be happening on Friday. Then in the next chapter, I show times past by having them get the results of that assessment, which means that they've either a week has passed, so they took the test on Friday, now some time has passed since the next week, and they're getting the results of the test back, implying that at least a few days or the weekend has gone by. Depending on the importance of time, I may need to explicitly state how many days have passed or hours between scenes. Sometimes that's necessary, other times it's not. Either way, these awkward skips can be smoothed over with a single sentence, though building them up and expanding on these transitions makes them easier to read. So, for example, in the middle of the chapter, I might plant the seeds for the next transition where the subsequent chapter will pick up. Then by the end of the chapter, I add the real transition. These are great for creating page-turning moments. So think of Chekhov's gun, where we introduce a gun in Act 1, then it needs to go off in Act 3. Now, putting this to our actual works or the specific transitions, let's say a character sees a ghost in the middle of the chapter, and then by the end of the chapter, said ghost pushes them out the window, and that's the end of the chapter. If I pick up in the next scene with the character taking action, like using a grappling hook to stop their fall, that might work because I've set up that buildup of, hey, there's a ghost. Hey, the ghost pushed somebody out a window, and now they're trying to react to it. But if instead I picked up with another transition where the character is maybe terrified of the fall and is broadly calculating how much time they have before they stop following, or they could be running through options to escape before choosing what to do. So they might say, oh, I have a grappling hook, but the rope is frayed, so I don't know if that'll necessarily work. And then maybe I could just take this dagger and I'll try and jam it into the wall on my way down, and hopefully that'll slow me enough to stop my fall, or anything along those lines. Or they might just take their chances and decide to use the grappling hook. Either way, having those debates in there can help smooth over everything that's happening and give a little bit more clarity to what's going on. I don't always do elaborate transitions, especially if one chapter leads right into the next. Some don't need transitions at all. At least I consider within the draft 0 to draft 1 phase whether I need to add something in progressing between those moments. My intention is to clarify the where, the when, and the who of my scenes. The who is very important if multiple characters are present, and so that helps certain characters not get lost or forgotten about, which is also something I'm very guilty of, where I have a large ensemble cast, which I slowly have been whittling down as the books progress. And book 4, we have a solid crew of 6, which is a lot easier to manage. And even then, you still have scenes where characters get lost because they might be focusing on one or two of them, but the other characters are still there, so they still need to kind of participate in the conversations. And so going from draft 0 to draft 1, I can identify where characters might be forgotten and then resolve it by giving them a line or two here or there. Next up is number 3, tension. Question we should ask ourselves is the tension correct across my chapters? Does the tension build? Is it an internal or external conflict, and is it increasing? Do I need to maybe deflate the moment with a joke? These are all the questions that we need to ask. And if I can't think of a good way to raise or diffuse the tension, then I'll make a note to myself that is what the scene is missing. And so I'll need to fix it further on down in a future draft. I'll then go back to it and I can address it on a scene by scene basis, or take a more holistic approach by gradually raising the stakes over multiple chapters. Now, for this improvement step, it works a lot better if I'm reading the draft from start to finish. If I'm going at a piecewise approach where I'm either reviewing the chapters one by one by one as soon as I finish writing them, or I'm doing maybe batches where I have 4 chapters in a row, yes, I can see some progression of tension, but I may be missing how the entire book reads. So if I'm like, oh, here's 4 chapters, I want the tension to keep increasing, keep increasing, keep increasing. Well, maybe there needs to be a pause somewhere in there. There can't be all car chases, explosions, fist fights, etc. So if I read the book from start to finish, I can decide where that tension needs to shift, or where there needs to be downtime to have the characters absorb and consider everything that's happened to them. So if I'm doing the smaller iterations of draft 0 to draft 1, I might miss larger tension shifts. Whereas if I'm doing start to finish, that has its own weaknesses where I might forget how the tension is going. So I need to read the chapters a little bit, the chapters one at a time. And again, it's all about balance. So I can do very small tension moments, small tense moments within the chapter itself, and it's very easy for me to recognize how to build the tension across the chapter. It is harder to do that for the book as a whole, but it does help out a lot more than just doing a small chapter or rather the chapters can feel out of place if I don't do the tension correctly. And I mentioned adding notes to myself if I feel like the tension is wrong. Well, number 4, for draft 0 to draft 1, I like to do something called Science the Science. In draft 0, I'll leave these notes to myself that say to do on them whenever I need to perform research. This might be locations or specifically science details, or even check in my notes the color of a character's eyes. And I keep coming back to that because I did make a mistake in a few of one of the character's eyes going from one chapter to the next. And then I realized that I made a mistake. And then I realized that only one of those was right based on the previous book. So I had to go back to the previous book to figure out which one was the mistake and then which one was the correct way I was remembering it. Anyways, the eye color in draft 0 conflicted with the color I defined in the previous novel, but I wasn't going to stop writing to determine whether or not I had the color of their eyes correct. So I had a note to myself to go back and do a previous book and to figure it out exactly how this character looked, so I was describing them correctly. And rather than break up that writing routine, I, like I said, made a note to myself and I came back to it. So in draft 1, I'll take the time to expand on all these placeholders that I created to not break up my writing pace while in the middle of writing draft 0. When I work on getting a complete draft 1, that's the time to figure these moments out. So I'll be revising, I'll be writing some stuff, I'll be writing and filling in some of the gaps between draft 0 and draft 1, but I'll also come to a note to myself that says, do this research. What color is this person's eyes? And then I can actually take the time to pause, to consider it, to think, and to do the steps needed to revise that draft. Now, I do this a lot more from drafts 2 and on, and I can make sure that these new moments then make sense. Where, because I added in completely new content with my notes to myself, where either the science is right, but does it make sense for how the character would say it? Does this character know enough about the science to accurately describe it? Or if I had a note to, hey, flesh out this scene to make sure that it's more vivid, then I go back in and I write those moments. But again, those are new moments. So even though this is technically draft 2, I still have moments in it that are basically like a draft 0. So I might need to do this iteratively and revise or review the different parts of the story. So that way I make sure that everything is up to snuff for the completed draft revisions. And then lastly, we have number 5, ligaments. Do the characters make sense? Does the timeline make sense? If one scene is during lunch and the next chapter begins at night, does that make sense? If I made a mistake and the 2 chapters are supposed to happen maybe over an hour-long time period, or maybe they were accidentally out of order, then I need to shift at least one of the settings to earlier or later. Likewise, I can ask, is the character furious with the main character in one chapter and then enthralled by them in the next? The story's muscles need better binding because that will clash, where a character jumps from being really enamored by the main character and then disliking them in the next. And yes, there can be reasons for that to happen or sudden shifts to cause that, but without that connecting tissue, it doesn't make sense. And you're kind of getting whiplash going back and forth. And along with those ligaments, revising draft 0 to draft 1 is where I find those pesky plot holes. These are easier to fix in an early draft, and that gives me more time to fix those moments if I made mistakes. So if I recognize that there's a problem and something's missing from my story, then I'll go ahead and write it in. But in writing that new part, I might introduce a new issue. So the earlier I add in those details, the sooner I can recognize or detect that I've added in a new problem. It's all like coding or software testing, where the best moment to discover an issue is the moment it's coded, or actually before then when you're designing the entire application. But in theory, the best time after that is the moment that a coder introduces a bug into their software. Because if it goes past them, then you're starting to add in testing and you're starting to add into production where someone might call in and then you have a whole helpline. So the cost to fix a bug is much, much less the earlier you identify it. Likewise, with writing, the cost to fix an issue, a plot hole, whatever, it is a lot less on us, the author. It costs a lot less, whether that's, I mean, cost, sure. If an editor catches something, that will obviously cost a lot more, but it might cost us a lot less time to fix that issue and to do it earlier than obviously later, or worst case after after you've already published the book, you recognize that there's a mistake and then you need to go in and fix it, and it's a whole mess. So when these clashes occur, it can break a character's immersion, and that's why I want to be really, really careful in how I handle these situations. So again, if I make a significant change from draft 0 to draft 1, I do again need to be mindful of the changes, because any new sentence, paragraph, or chapter I add to draft 0, if it's that bad and I need to actually add in a chapter, well, that then becomes the draft 0 version. It's less refined. There's a higher likelihood of error. So guess what? Everything I did before now, I need to do it all again. Yay. This is my process when starting to make revisions to my manuscript. Like I said, I'm currently doing limited revisions on the 8 chapters of close to 20,000 words that I've written for my 4th manuscript. It's time consuming, yet in the end, I'm going to have a manuscript that will be a little more refined. And this is my initial attempt at quality control. Obviously, I'm going to miss a lot, but going from 0 to 1 and really considering what that means and to really look at those issues, it gives me something that is a slightly more polished work that I can then ask for help from alpha and beta readers without them wasting their time on smaller issues or risk losing interest due to the manuscript being too rough. That's one of the issues that I myself as a beta reader have come across, where I can recognize that there are enough issues within the story that it shows that the author didn't really take their time. If they didn't take their time, then it's kind of an indication that the story isn't as fleshed out as it should be. And so you kind of, by having those issues present, it might indicate that the story is not as strong as it could be. So we want to try and when we ask somebody for help, we want to try and get the story to as decent of a place as we can within a reasonable amount, within reason. Now, sorry, I have a hair in my eye. Within reason, because obviously the beta readers, the alpha readers, they're there to help us make our story better, but they need to have a starting place. And with that, I am Ben Pick, and thank you for joining me in Running to Write. So please do all the YouTube things like liking and subscribing, and let me know in the comments if you're a fan of Draft Zeros. How thorough are your edits before seeking alpha and beta readers? Do you just write through, do a quick edit, and then it's good to go? Or do you really take the time to iterate and to think about the entire manuscript every step of the way. And before we head out, I am going to check. Oh boy. Check the comments. Huh. Yeah, so I do agree that Pro Writing Aid is really helpful with grammar, but it's also not perfect. And there have been a lot. So whenever I come across a grammar mistake, I like to fix it as is at that moment, because that way I know that it will be fixed. Hmm. Oh boy, we have some fun, fun English versus UK, American English versus UK comments. Yeah. So fun fact about placeholders, I've actually read a book where I can see that there were some special characters that were used for a placeholder. Unfortunately, they had misspelled whatever word was within the placeholder. So the misspelled word within the placeholder wasn't caught, and that was made into the final draft, which sucks for that author. Oh, I have all of that. I have color coded index cards for everything. Plus, I have different documents for character relations, plus each of the characters' physical descriptions. I have all that prepared. The question is, sorry, but even though I have that all prepared, even though I have that on index cards, even though I have that in Word documents upon Word documents, I don't want to stop my process to look up how a character should look. So instead, I will just sort of plow through with my writing, and then I'll come back to it later to add in those details. Cool. Well, I'm all caught up. And with that, I will see you next time. Until then, let's get editing. And I think next week, as a preview, I'm going to be talking about how to write smart characters. Specifically because I watched The Boys, and I did hint at this a while ago. But I didn't really enjoy the season. And there were a couple of characters that stood out to me as just badly written. So one of them, I mean, spoiler alert, the genius character, a big part of my problem is that there was an impossible, a series of impossibilities that were a series of events that would have been absolutely impossible to predict. That this character then comes at the end and says, "Oh, well, everything went according to my plan, so we're all good now." And I'm going to talk about my thoughts on The Boys, and then kind of discuss how we can write genius characters, intelligent characters, and make them, one, believable, two, interesting, three, not precognisant, because that's cognition, precognition. I think that's how I pronounce it, because that's how it came off in The Boys, and four, just why it shouldn't be a Deus Ex Machina to kind of ruin and tie things together. Anyways, like I said, I'll see you next time. Until then, let's all get editing and have a wonderful, wonderful week.